The strongest people are often the ones who cry where nobody can see them. Rain tapped gently against the towering glass walls of Hayes Technologies as downtown Chicago shimmered beneath a blanket of silver reflections. Most of the city had already gone home. Office lights disappeared floor by floor until only a handful remained glowing against the November sky. Somewhere on the 42nd floor, one office was still illuminated long after everyone else had left. Ethan Walker pushed his maintenance cart down the polished hallway with quiet determination, checking thermostats, replacing burned-out lights, and making certain everything would be ready before the morning rush. At 41 years old, Ethan had learned that invisible work was still honorable work. Nobody applauded the man who stayed after midnight to keep the building running. Nobody noticed the father who skipped dinner so overtime could pay for school supplies, winter boots, and piano lessons for his 9-year-old daughter, Emma. That was all right with him. Some kinds of love were never meant to be loud. The faint scent of fresh coffee lingered near the executive conference room, mixing with the clean smell of polished wood and rain drifting through the building whenever the revolving doors opened downstairs. Ethan glanced at the family photograph tucked carefully inside his wallet as he waited for the service elevator. Emma smiled back, wearing her oversized yellow raincoat, her missing front tooth making her grin even brighter. He smiled without realizing it before sliding the wallet back into his jacket pocket. Every long shift became worthwhile the moment he imagined her running into his arms the following morning. The executive floor was normally silent after 8 o'clock. Tonight felt different. The silence carried weight, almost as though the building itself were holding its breath. Ethan pushed his cart toward the corner office reserved for Charlotte Hayes, the company's celebrated chief executive officer. Employees described her with admiration, respect, and sometimes fear. Investors trusted every decision she made. Business magazines called her one of America's most influential women under 40. Nobody ever mentioned loneliness. Nobody ever imagined weakness. Ethan had only seen her from a distance during company meetings. She always walked with calm confidence, dressed in elegant tailored suits, speaking with quiet authority that filled entire rooms without raising her voice. She looked like someone who belonged above the clouds, far away from ordinary people carrying toolboxes and lunch pails. Then he heard it. At first he thought the rain had become heavier. A soft sound echoed through the empty hallway before disappearing beneath the humming air vents. Ethan stopped walking. Several seconds passed. Then the sound returned. It was not the wind. It was not machinery. It was someone trying very hard not to cry. His hand rested gently on the handle of his maintenance cart. He looked toward the slightly open door of the executive office where warm golden light spilled quietly into the dark hallway. Every instinct told him to keep walking. It was not his place. Whatever happened behind that door belonged to another world entirely. Yet another quiet sob drifted through the silence, fragile enough to make the enormous office tower suddenly feel painfully small. Ethan slowly stepped forward, stopping just outside the doorway. He raised his hand and knocked softly against the polished wood. There was no answer, only silence. Then, barely louder than a whisper carried by the rain itself, a woman's exhausted voice finally spoke from inside the room. "Please, do not leave." The words settled over the quiet office more heavily than the rain against the windows. Ethan Walker slowly stepped inside before gently closing the door behind him, careful not to make the room feel any smaller than it already did. Charlotte Hayes sat on the polished hardwood floor beside the floor-to-ceiling windows, her navy suit still perfectly tailored despite the long day, a pair of high heels resting several feet away as though she had simply run out of strength to wear them any longer. The glowing skyline of Chicago stretched endlessly behind her, yet she seemed unable to see any of it. A silver picture frame rested in her lap, while silent tears continued slipping down her face. Ethan looked around the elegant office filled with awards, photographs of company milestones, and shelves lined with business books. Everything reflected extraordinary success, but nothing softened the loneliness filling the room. He did not ask what had happened. He did not offer empty reassurance. Instead, he quietly wheeled his maintenance cart toward the small employee kitchenette connected to the executive office. A few minutes later, the gentle aroma of chamomile tea drifted through the room. Ethan returned carrying 2 simple ceramic mugs. He carefully placed one on the floor within Charlotte's reach before sitting several feet away, leaving enough distance to respect the privacy she had not yet decided to surrender. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Rain continued tracing quiet paths across the glass while the city lights shimmered below like scattered stars. Charlotte finally looked at the steaming cup before giving a tired smile that barely reached her eyes. Most people would have pretended they never heard anything. Ethan wrapped both hands around his own mug. Sometimes pretending is easier. Charlotte nodded slowly. Then why did you stay? Ethan looked toward the rain outside instead of directly at her. Because everybody deserves one person who does not walk away when life becomes heavy. Silence returned, but this time it felt gentler. Charlotte lifted the warm cup into her hands, letting the heat settle into her fingers before taking a careful sip. You make tea like someone who has done this before, she said quietly. Ethan smiled faintly. My daughter says tea cannot solve every problem, but it reminds people they do not have to face them cold. Charlotte let out the smallest laugh, surprising herself as much as him. It lasted only a second, yet it changed something inside the room. She lowered her eyes toward the silver frame resting against her knees. Ethan noticed an older family photograph inside, but deliberately looked away before he could recognize the faces. Whatever story the picture carried belonged to her until she decided otherwise. You are very kind, Charlotte whispered after another long silence. Ethan gently shook his head. No. I just know what an empty room feels like. Those words lingered between them with quiet honesty. Charlotte looked at him for the first time not as the building's maintenance employee, but simply as another human being carrying invisible burdens. Outside, another wave of rain rolled across the skyline, soft and steady, while the office lights reflected warmly against the windows. The distance between the celebrated chief executive officer and the single father who quietly cared for the building no longer felt measured by job titles or salaries. It was measured only by two people sitting on the same floor, holding warm cups of tea, discovering that grief often recognized grief long before names, positions, or success ever mattered. Charlotte Hayes held the silver picture frame a little tighter before finally turning it toward Ethan Walker. The photograph showed a younger version of herself standing beside a smiling man beneath a summer sky, both of them laughing as they held coffee cups instead of posing for the camera. His name was Michael, she said quietly. He believed life should never be rushed. Her fingers gently traced the edge of the frame. Tomorrow would have been our 15th wedding anniversary. Ethan lowered his eyes respectfully, allowing the silence to honor the memory before speaking. He looks like someone who made people feel safe. Charlotte smiled through fresh tears. He did. The rain continued falling against the towering windows while the city lights blurred into soft streaks across the glass. He passed away 6 years ago after a long illness, she continued. Everyone told me that time would make it easier. Instead, I learned how to become busy enough that nobody noticed I was still grieving. She looked around the enormous executive office filled with awards and polished furniture. I built a company that everyone admires, but I also built walls that nobody could see. Ethan listened without interrupting. He understood that some stories became lighter simply because another person carried them for a little while. After a long pause, Charlotte looked toward him with quiet curiosity. You said you know what an empty room feels like. Ethan nodded slowly. My wife, Rebecca, passed away 8 years ago. Charlotte's expression softened immediately. I am so sorry. Ethan offered a gentle smile that carried both sadness and gratitude. Thank you. He looked down at the warm tea resting between his hands. Emma was only 1 year old. I spent months pretending I was strong because everyone kept telling me my daughter needed me to be. He let out a quiet breath. One evening I realized something. She did not need a perfect father. She only needed one who kept coming home. Charlotte listened with complete attention, the distance between them growing smaller with every honest sentence. How did you survive it? She asked softly. Ethan looked toward the rain-covered skyline. I stopped trying to outrun grief. I invited it to sit beside me until it became part of love instead of fear. Charlotte closed her eyes for a moment, allowing those words to settle into the silence surrounding them. For years, she had buried every painful memory beneath meetings, flights, presentations, and impossible schedules. Tonight, for the first time, she wondered whether healing had never been about forgetting it all. She gently placed the photograph on the floor beside her. Everyone believes I have everything, she whispered. Ethan smiled kindly. The world usually notices success before it notices loneliness. A faint laugh escaped Charlotte, warmer than before. You should not understand me this well. Ethan shook his head. I do not understand your company or your board meetings. He looked at her with quiet sincerity. But I understand missing someone you still talk to when nobody else is listening. Charlotte felt another tear slide down her cheek. Yet this one carried relief instead of despair. Outside, the rain continued washing across the city as midnight quietly arrived. Inside the office, two strangers from completely different worlds remained seated on the same polished floor with 2 cups of cooling tea, no longer trying to fix each other's pain, only proving that even the deepest wounds become easier to carry when someone chooses to stay and listen. When Ethan Walker returned to work the following evening, he expected the executive floor to feel exactly as it always had, polished, quiet, and distant. Instead, he noticed something small that should not have mattered but somehow did. The door to Charlotte Hayes' office remained slightly open instead of completely closed. Warm light spilled into the hallway just as it had the night before, but this time there were no tears waiting behind it. Charlotte looked up from her desk when she heard the familiar sound of his maintenance cart rolling across the floor. For the first time since they had met, she smiled before he said a single word. Good evening, Ethan. He returned the smile with gentle respect. Good evening, Charlotte. Neither of them mentioned the previous night. They did not need to. Some conversations became part of people without ever needing to be repeated. Ethan quietly replaced a flickering light fixture near the reception area while Charlotte finished reviewing documents for the following morning's board meeting. Before he reached the elevator, her voice stopped him once again. Would you have time for another cup of tea? He glanced at the clock before nodding. I think I can manage that. A few minutes later, 2 familiar ceramic mugs rested on the small table beside the office windows. Rain had disappeared, leaving the city glowing beneath a clear evening sky filled with thousands of lights. Charlotte wrapped both hands around the warm cup and let out a peaceful breath. I realized something after you left last night, she said quietly. Ethan waited patiently. It was the first time in years that I went home without pretending everything was fine. Ethan smiled gently. Sometimes honesty is more restful than sleep. Charlotte laughed softly. You have a way of saying simple things that somehow stay with people. He looked down at the tea before answering. My daughter says children understand the truth because adults make everything too complicated. That made Charlotte smile even more. Tell me about her. Ethan's face immediately brightened in a way Charlotte had never seen before. He reached into his wallet and carefully unfolded a small school photograph. Emma stood proudly in her yellow raincoat, holding a library book almost as large as she was. She loves reading, Ethan said warmly. She believes every book deserves a second chance before anyone decides they do not like it. Charlotte studied the picture with genuine affection. She looks wonderfully happy. Ethan nodded. She reminds me every day that life keeps moving forward even when our hearts still carry yesterday. Charlotte quietly looked out across the skyline. I do not think I have moved forward very well. Ethan gently shook his head. You came to work every day. You led thousands of employees. You kept going even when it hurt. He smiled kindly. That sounds like moving forward to me. Charlotte lowered her eyes as emotion quietly returned, but this time no tears followed. Instead, she felt something unfamiliar settling inside her. Hope. Before Ethan gathered his tools to continue working, Charlotte spoke one more time. Would you mind if we had tea again sometime? Ethan answered with the same quiet sincerity that had first led him through her office door. I think healing usually happens one conversation at a time. As he disappeared into the hallway, Charlotte remained by the window holding the warm mug between her hands. The office no longer felt impossibly large. The silence no longer felt empty. Somewhere in the building, a maintenance cart rolled gently toward another floor, and for the first time in many years, she realized she was already looking forward to tomorrow. Over the following weeks, an unexpected rhythm quietly settled into both of their lives. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, after the last employees had left Hayes Technologies and the city lights slowly replaced the afternoon sun, Ethan Walker arrived on the executive floor with his familiar maintenance cart, and somewhere between replacing light fixtures and checking air filters, 2 cups of chamomile tea would quietly appear beside the wide office windows. Neither of them planned those moments. They simply happened, becoming as natural as the evening skyline itself. Charlotte Hayes gradually stopped scheduling late meetings just to avoid returning to an empty home. Instead, she found herself finishing important work before Ethan reached the 42nd floor. Almost without realizing, she was looking forward to hearing the gentle sound of his cart rolling through the hallway. One Thursday evening, Ethan arrived carrying a small paper bag from a neighborhood bakery. Charlotte looked at him with amused curiosity. "What is this?" she asked. Ethan smiled modestly. "Emma insisted I could not bring tea without dessert." Charlotte opened the bag and discovered 2 homemade cinnamon rolls wrapped carefully in wax paper. A handwritten note rested inside. In neat childish handwriting it read, "Sharing makes people smile longer. Love, Emma." Charlotte felt her heart soften immediately. She wrote this. Ethan nodded proudly. She believes every stranger is simply a friend who has not smiled yet. Charlotte quietly laughed, a genuine laugh that filled the office more warmly than any conversation before it. "Your daughter sounds wiser than most executives I know." Ethan grinned. "She definitely asks better questions." As they shared the simple dessert beside the windows, Charlotte found herself speaking more freely than she had in years. She admitted she had almost forgotten what ordinary evenings felt like. "Everything in my calendar has a purpose," she said thoughtfully. "Meetings, flights, presentations, interviews. Somewhere along the way, I stopped leaving room for life itself." Ethan looked out across the glowing streets below. "Children are good at fixing that." Charlotte smiled gently. "I would like to meet Emma someday, if she would not mind." Ethan hesitated only for a moment before answering honestly. "She would probably ask whether you like books before she asked your name." Charlotte laughed again. "Then I had better prepare the right answer." The following Saturday afternoon, Ethan invited Charlotte to the small neighborhood library where Emma attended her weekly reading club. Charlotte exchanged her tailored business suit for a simple cream sweater, blue jeans, and comfortable walking shoes, blending naturally into the quiet community around her. Emma noticed them the moment they entered and rushed toward her father before looking curiously at Charlotte. "Is this your tea friend?" she asked with complete innocence. Ethan smiled. "Yes, sweetheart. This is Charlotte." Emma extended her small hand with perfect confidence. "I am happy you are not lonely anymore." Charlotte felt unexpectedly emotional as she gently shook the little girl's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. Emma looked up with the simple honesty only children possessed. "Daddy says people heal faster when somebody remembers to ask how their day was." Charlotte looked toward Ethan, who seemed slightly embarrassed by his daughter's words. She smiled warmly before quietly answering, "Your father is teaching me many important things." As afternoon sunlight poured through the library windows and children happily turned the pages of colorful books all around them, Charlotte realized that the peace she had spent years searching for had never been hidden inside another achievement. It had quietly been waiting inside ordinary conversations, shared tea, homemade cinnamon rolls, and the gentle kindness of a father and daughter who had unknowingly begun healing her heart one simple day at a time. As autumn slowly deepened across Chicago, the quiet friendship that had begun with 2 cups of tea continued growing into something neither Ethan Walker nor Charlotte Hayes tried to name. They simply welcomed each ordinary day as it came. Some evenings they met in the executive office after everyone had gone home. Other weekends they explored neighborhood parks with Emma, who somehow made every outing feel like an adventure worth remembering. Charlotte found herself smiling more often than she had in years, and the employees inside Hayes Technologies quietly noticed the difference. The chief executive officer who had once hurried through every hallway now paused to greet receptionists, remembered birthdays, and occasionally left the office before sunset. One Monday morning, her board of directors gathered for an important strategy meeting. Charts filled the conference room screens, while financial forecasts covered the polished table. Near the end of the presentation, one director stood with obvious excitement. "We have extraordinary news," he announced. "The Global Healthcare Alliance has offered you the position of executive chair for North America. The headquarters are in New York, and the compensation package is unlike anything our industry has seen." The room immediately filled with congratulations. Every executive believed the decision had already been made. Charlotte thanked them politely, but her smile faded almost as quickly as it appeared. She accepted the documents and quietly carried them back to her office after the meeting ended. That evening, Ethan arrived with his maintenance card exactly as he always did. He immediately noticed the unopened folder resting beside the window. Charlotte handed it to him without saying a word. Ethan carefully read only the first page before closing it again. "This is an incredible opportunity," he said sincerely. Charlotte nodded. "Everyone says it is the opportunity of a lifetime." Ethan looked toward the city skyline, glowing beneath the setting sun. "Do you agree?" Charlotte remained silent for several moments before answering. "6 months ago, I would have signed the papers before finishing the first page." She smiled sadly. "Today I cannot stop thinking about everything I would leave behind." Ethan placed the folder gently back on her desk. "Only you can decide what success means." Charlotte looked directly at him. "What would you do?" Ethan quietly shook his head. "My answer belongs to my life, not yours." He paused before speaking again. "But Emma once told me something after I turned down a better-paying job because it required traveling every week." Charlotte listened carefully. "She said people should never trade the place where they are loved for the place where they are applauded." Those simple words settled gently over the room. Charlotte looked out through the enormous windows, but instead of seeing the brilliant skyline, she remembered Emma's handwritten note inside the bakery bag, the neighborhood library filled with laughter, 2 warm mugs of tea beside the rain-covered windows, and the peaceful feeling that had slowly returned to her heart. Later that evening, she drove home instead of staying late at the office. As she entered her quiet house, she noticed something she had ignored for years. The rooms no longer felt empty because of Michael's absence alone. They felt empty because she had spent too long believing success could replace human connection. She placed the New York proposal on her kitchen table beside a photograph of Michael and quietly whispered, "I finally understand what you were trying to teach me." Outside, a light rain began falling once again, tapping gently against the windows with the same familiar rhythm that had first brought 2 lonely hearts together inside a silent office high above the city. The following morning, Charlotte Hayes entered the executive boardroom carrying the New York proposal with calm confidence. Yet everyone around the polished conference table assumed they already knew how the meeting would end. Senior directors smiled expectantly, while financial analysts prepared presentations celebrating the extraordinary expansion that awaited the company. One board member leaned forward with obvious excitement. "Congratulations, Charlotte. This is the promotion every leader dreams about." Another executive added, "Your influence will reach millions more people." Charlotte thanked them politely before placing the proposal in the center of the table. For several quiet seconds, she simply looked around the room. She saw talented professionals, trusted colleagues, and years of shared accomplishments. Then she smiled gently. "Before I answer," she began, "I would like to tell you something I have learned during the past few months." The room became completely silent. "For many years, I believed success meant climbing every mountain placed in front of me. I accepted every challenge because I thought achievement could eventually fill every empty place inside my heart." She paused before continuing. "Instead, I discovered that even the highest office can still feel lonely when nobody is waiting to ask how your day was." Several board members exchanged thoughtful glances. Charlotte rested one hand on the proposal before quietly closing the folder. "I have decided to decline the position." The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire conference room. One director spoke carefully. "May we ask why?" Charlotte answered with peaceful certainty. "Because I finally understand the difference between building a remarkable career and building a meaningful life." Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. The discussion that followed remained respectful, yet Charlotte never hesitated. Her decision had already been made long before she entered the room. That evening, she drove across the city instead of returning home immediately. Ethan Walker had already finished his shift and was helping Emma choose storybooks inside the neighborhood library. The warm reading room glowed beneath soft yellow lights, while children quietly turned colorful pages beside their parents. Emma noticed Charlotte first and ran toward her with an excited smile. "You came." Charlotte knelt beside her and returned the smile. "I would not have missed story time." Ethan looked at Charlotte's peaceful expression and somehow understood without asking a single question. They stepped outside while Emma remained inside listening to the librarian begin the evening story. Autumn air carried the gentle scent of fallen leaves through the quiet street. Charlotte looked at Ethan before speaking. "I turned it down." Ethan nodded slowly. "Are you at peace with your decision?" Charlotte smiled in a way he had never seen before, free from exhaustion and free from pretending. "More than I have been in years." Ethan looked toward the library windows where Emma sat happily, surrounded by books and laughter. Then you chose well. Charlotte quietly slipped her hands into the pockets of her coat. Do you know what surprised me the most? Ethan waited. Nobody on the board tried to convince me I was making a mistake. They simply wanted to know whether I was certain. She laughed softly. For the first time, I was. Just then, Emma came running outside, carrying a library book against her chest. She looked from Ethan to Charlotte with innocent curiosity. Can I ask both of you something? They nodded together. Emma smiled thoughtfully. If people become happier when they help each other heal, maybe that is what family really means. Ethan and Charlotte exchanged a quiet glance. Beneath the golden streetlights, neither of them answered immediately because sometimes the truest answers were not spoken at all. Sometimes they simply appeared in the peaceful silence shared between three people who no longer felt alone. Winter quietly arrived over Chicago, covering the city with crisp mornings, glowing streetlights, and the peaceful rhythm that always seemed to follow a season of change. Inside Hayes Technologies, employees continued noticing the gentle transformation in Charlotte Hayes. She still led the company with remarkable wisdom, but now she greeted security guards by name, shared coffee with new employees, and left handwritten notes thanking teams after difficult projects. The walls surrounding her heart had not disappeared overnight, but they had slowly been replaced by open doors. Ethan Walker noticed the difference every evening as he completed his maintenance rounds. Their conversations no longer centered only on grief. They spoke about favorite childhood books, holiday traditions, Emma's school projects, and the simple beauty of ordinary days. Healing had quietly made room for joy. One Saturday morning, Charlotte accepted an invitation to attend Emma's elementary school winter festival. The school gymnasium overflowed with handmade decorations, children's artwork, and families cheering proudly from folding chairs. Charlotte wore a simple wool coat, comfortable boots, and a warm smile that looked completely different from the composed expression she carried into corporate meetings. Emma spotted her immediately and hurried across the room with bright excitement. You really came. Charlotte knelt beside her and smiled. I promised I would. Ethan watched the moment from several feet away, feeling grateful for how naturally the two had grown close. During the festival, the children performed holiday songs before presenting handmade ornaments to the people who had encouraged them throughout the year. Emma carefully walked onto the small stage holding a simple wooden star she had painted herself. When her name was called, she looked across the audience before speaking into the microphone with complete sincerity. This star is for someone who taught me that lonely people can smile again. She walked directly toward Charlotte and gently placed the ornament into her hands. The entire room quietly applauded while Charlotte struggled to hold back grateful tears. She hugged Emma gently before whispering, I will treasure this forever. Later that afternoon, the three of them stopped at a small neighborhood cafe where snowflakes drifted peacefully outside the windows. Hot chocolate, tea, and fresh cinnamon cookies rested between them, while warm laughter replaced the silence that had once defined their lives. Charlotte looked at the little wooden star resting carefully beside her cup. Nobody has ever given me something that means this much, she admitted softly. Ethan smiled. Children rarely measure gifts by their price. Emma looked up from her marshmallows with thoughtful curiosity. Daddy says hearts remember kindness longer than money. Charlotte laughed gently before reaching across the table and squeezing Emma's hand. Your father has been right about many things. As evening settled over the city, they walked slowly through the softly falling snow beneath rows of glowing holiday lights. Charlotte realized she no longer measured time by anniversaries of loss or impossible business goals. She measured it by afternoons filled with laughter, evenings shared over warm drinks, and the comforting certainty that someone would always be happy to see her tomorrow. The cold winter air surrounded them, yet none of them felt alone anymore. Somewhere deep inside, the quiet ache that had once defined both Ethan and Charlotte had begun transforming into something stronger than sorrow. Without either of them noticing exactly when it happened, friendship had quietly become home. 1 year quietly passed, and the city that had once witnessed two lonely strangers crossing paths on a rainy night now seemed to celebrate an entirely different story. Hayes Technologies continued growing under Charlotte Hayes's thoughtful leadership, but the greatest changes could never be measured by annual reports or financial success. Employees often smiled when they saw their chief executive officer leaving the building before sunset, carrying a simple paper bag from the neighborhood bakery instead of another stack of business files. They noticed that laughter had gradually replaced the silence surrounding the executive floor, and nobody questioned why the maintenance schedule somehow always matched the evenings she remained at the office. Ethan Walker still pushed the same maintenance cart through the polished hallways with quiet dignity, greeting every employee by name and finishing every task with the same humble dedication that had always defined him. Nothing about his character had changed. Only his world had become warmer. Emma had grown taller over the year, yet she still carried library books wherever she went and continued believing that kindness was the most important language people could ever learn. One Saturday afternoon, she invited Ethan and Charlotte to the neighborhood park where the first spring flowers had begun blooming beside the walking paths. Families gathered beneath bright blue skies while children chased colorful kites across the open field. Emma spread a small picnic blanket beneath a maple tree before carefully placing 3 steaming cups on the grass. "Tea always tastes better outside," she announced proudly. Charlotte laughed gently. "I think you might be right." They spent hours talking about ordinary things, favorite books, weekend recipes, school projects, and future dreams. There were no discussions about stock prices, promotions, or impossible expectations. There was only peaceful conversation carried gently by the spring breeze. As the afternoon sun slowly settled lower across the park, Emma reached into her backpack and removed a folded drawing she had been quietly protecting all day. She opened it carefully before placing it in front of Ethan and Charlotte. The picture showed a rainy office window on one side and a bright spring park on the other. Between them stood 3 smiling figures holding warm cups of tea together beneath a single rainbow. Across the top, Emma had written, "Sometimes hearts find each other before people do." Charlotte looked at the drawing with grateful tears shining softly in her eyes. Ethan smiled with the quiet pride only a father could feel. Emma looked at both of them before asking the question that had been resting inside her heart for many months. "Do you know why I like rainy days now?" They both shook their heads. Emma smiled gently. "Because if it had not rained that night, 2 people who needed each other might never have met." None of them spoke for several peaceful moments. They simply listened as birds sang above the trees and children laughed somewhere across the park. Charlotte quietly reached for Ethan's hand, and this time he gently held hers without hesitation. There were no dramatic promises, no grand declarations, and no audience waiting to applaud. Their story had never needed any of those things. It had been written through cups of tea shared in silence, honest conversations after long days, the wisdom of a little girl, and the courage to remain present when another heart was hurting. As gentle sunlight bathed the park in warm golden light, Ethan looked toward the clear blue sky where no rain clouds remained and quietly realized that healing had never meant forgetting the people they had lost. Healing meant carrying those memories forward while allowing new love to enter without guilt. Charlotte understood the same truth at exactly the same moment. Their hearts had not replaced yesterday. They had simply made room for tomorrow. And somewhere beyond the busy streets of Chicago, life continued moving forward with quiet grace, proving that the strongest love stories are not built by perfect circumstances, but by ordinary people who choose, day after day, to stay beside one another until loneliness finally becomes home. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more stories of courage, kindness, and second chances, because the people the world overlooks often leave the greatest impact.